I was standing inside the wedding venue I dreamed about for nearly 3 years when my father smiled at me and said, "Your sister needs this place more than you do." Why was my reserved wedding date suddenly gone? Why was Brianna holding the bridal folder with my name scratched out? And why did the elderly owner freeze the moment she read my last name? I still had every receipt, every email, every signed reservation contract in my hands. But something inside an old leather archive seemed to matter even more. Then Eleanor Whitmore looked at me and quietly whispered, "You're Thomas Harrison's granddaughter, aren't you?" In that moment, I realized this wasn't just about my wedding anymore. Before I tell you what happened next, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Leave your country and your local time in the comments. I always enjoy seeing how many different places these stories reach. And if you enjoy thoughtful stories about family justice and finding the courage to set healthy boundaries, consider subscribing so you won't miss the next one. I wish I could tell you that what happened at Whitmore Manor was the first time my father had chosen my younger sister over me. It wasn't. By the time I was standing in that marble entrance hall with a canceled wedding reservation in one hand and years of disappointment in the other, I had spent most of my adult life convincing myself that I was imagining the pattern. My name is Kalani Harrison. I'm 32 years old, and I work as a commercial architect based in Charlotte, North Carolina. My job is equal parts creativity and precision. I design office buildings, mixed-use developments, and adaptive renovations that turn aging structures into spaces people actually enjoy using. Every decision I make at work has to be documented, supported, and approved. Assumptions are expensive. Evidence matters. That habit of collecting facts instead of reacting emotionally probably saved me long before I realized I would need it with my own family. Growing up, my parents liked telling people that I was the easy child. I earned scholarships. I rarely asked for money. I worked during college. When something went wrong, I usually figured it out myself. Whenever relatives complimented me, my father, Marcus Harrison, would laugh proudly. "Kalani doesn't need us. She's always been independent." Everyone smiled because it sounded like praise. I eventually understood what it really meant. Independent children are often expected to carry burdens without complaint. My younger sister Brianna was different. She was warm, outgoing, effortlessly social, and somehow always became the center of every family gathering. If she struggled financially, someone helped. If she changed careers, everyone encouraged her. If she made an expensive mistake, there was always another chance waiting. My parents called it support. I called it a safety net that never existed for me. That difference became clearer after college. I accepted an entry-level architecture position in Charlotte while living in a tiny one-bedroom apartment with furniture that mostly came from estate sales and Facebook Marketplace. Every paycheck had a purpose. Student loans, rent, professional licensing exams, health insurance. There wasn't much left afterward. Meanwhile, Brianna moved back home several times over the next few years while trying different jobs. Marketing, boutique retail, a wedding planning startup that lasted 6 months, an online clothing business that quietly disappeared. Every transition somehow involved my parents paying another bill. One Thanksgiving, I arrived carrying homemade desserts because I couldn't afford expensive gifts that year. Brianna pulled into the driveway behind me driving a brand new white luxury SUV. I stared for a moment before walking inside. Dad noticed immediately. "Nice, isn't it?" he asked proudly. "It is," I answered. "Congratulations, Brie." She smiled. "Thanks." I waited. No explanation came. Later that evening, while helping Mom wash dishes, I casually asked how Brianna managed the purchase. Mom hesitated just long enough for me to notice. "Your father helped with the down payment." "That's generous." "She needed reliable transportation." I nodded slowly. "I understand." And I truly tried to. until I remembered the previous spring. That was when my car's transmission failed. Repairing it would have cost nearly $5,000. Replacing it wasn't possible. When I asked Dad whether he knew a trustworthy mechanic who might offer a payment plan, he had looked genuinely sympathetic. "I'm sorry, sweetheart. I wish I could help. We're stretched pretty thin right now, so I spent almost 6 months taking commuter trains and ride shares until I could save enough to buy a used sedan." Apparently, stretched pretty thin had been flexible depending on which daughter was asking. I never mentioned the contradiction. Not because I didn't notice, because experience had taught me what would happen if I did. Dad would say life wasn't always equal. Mom would ask me not to create unnecessary conflict. Brianna would become uncomfortable. Then somehow I would end up apologizing for making everyone else feel guilty. It became easier to stay quiet, at least for a while. My fiancé, Ethan Brooks, was the first person who consistently noticed these patterns without me pointing them out. We met during a redevelopment project in Asheville. He was the lead civil engineer. I was overseeing architectural design. The first thing I liked about Ethan wasn't his sense of humor or his patience. It was the way he listened, really listened. He never interrupted to solve problems before understanding them. About a year into our relationship, we attended one of my parents' anniversary dinners. During dessert, Dad spent nearly 20 minutes telling relatives how proud he was that Brianna had recently become engaged to Lucas Reed, an investment advisor from Charleston. He praised Lucas's family, their social connections, their country club, their charitable foundation. Everyone clapped. Then my aunt looked toward Ethan. "And what about Kalani?" Dad smiled politely. "Oh, Ethan's a good guy." That was it. The conversation immediately returned to Brianna. Driving home, Ethan kept both hands on the steering wheel for several miles before speaking. "Can I ask you something?" "Always." "Has it always been like that?" I looked out the passenger window. "What do you mean, they're proud of you?" "I can tell. But they don't celebrate you." That sentence stayed with me for weeks, because it described something I had never managed to explain. There was affection. There was kindness. There was never quite the same enthusiasm. As though my accomplishments were expected, while Brianna's were extraordinary. When Ethan proposed 6 months later, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. I wasn't thinking about anyone else's expectations, just ours. We wanted a wedding that felt timeless instead of extravagant. Neither of us cared about celebrity venues or lavish displays. We wanted history, warmth, character, somewhere that felt like it already carried stories before ours began. That search led me to Whitmore Manor in Charleston. The first time I visited, I wasn't even engaged. I had been attending an architectural preservation conference nearby. One afternoon, I wandered through the property during a public heritage tour. The brick pathways, the centuries-old oak trees, the restored ballroom, the quiet gardens overlooking the water. It didn't feel like a business. It felt like a place people protected. As I walked through the estate, I remembered stories my grandfather Thomas Harrison used to tell me when I was little. He loved old buildings. Whenever he visited us, he'd point to historic churches, train stations, or old courthouses and explain how every generation leaves something behind for the next one. "Buildings remember people," Grandpa used to say, "if they're cared for." Standing at Whitmore Manor, I heard his voice as clearly as if he were beside me. That afternoon, I asked for a brochure, then another. Before leaving, I quietly placed a refundable reservation deposit for a spring wedding date almost 2 years away. Not because I knew I would get married there, because I knew if I ever did, that was where I wanted it to happen. When Ethan proposed 18 months later, all I had to do was call the venue and confirm the reservation. The coordinator laughed. "We've been wondering when you'd finally call." Everything felt perfect. Until one afternoon several months later, Dad came over to my house unexpectedly. He admired the engagement photos sitting on the bookshelf. Then he noticed the Whitmore Manor folder lying on the dining table. He picked it up before I could stop him.
"What's this place?"
"Our wedding venue." He flipped through the photographs slowly.
"It's beautiful."
"It really is." "Expensive," I smiled. "We've been saving for years." He nodded thoughtfully before setting the folder back down. "I've never heard of it."
"It books pretty far in advance."
He looked at one picture longer than the others. Then he quietly asked, "You're sure this is where you want to get married?" "I've never been more sure about anything." He smiled. "I hope everything works out." At the time, I thought it was an ordinary conversation. Looking back, it was probably the moment everything began. Because less than 24 hours after my father left my house, someone from Whitmore Manor accessed my reservation file. I wouldn't discover that detail until much later. But when Eleanor Whitmore called my cell phone later that evening after the confrontation, her first sentence made my stomach tighten. "Kelani," she said gently, "before the estate opens tomorrow morning, there's something in our archives that belongs to the Harrison family. I think you need to see it before anyone else does." I barely slept that night. Not because of the wedding, not even because my father had handed my dream venue to Brianna as though my reservation meant nothing. It was Eleanor's last sentence that kept replaying in my head. "There's something in our archives that belongs to the Harrison family." Over and over, I asked myself the same questions. What could possibly be sitting inside a wedding venue's archives with my family's name on it? Why had Eleanor looked so shocked when she read Harrison on my driver's license? And why had she insisted that I come alone before the estate officially opened? By 6:30 the next morning, Ethan and I were already driving toward Whitmore Manor. Charleston was unusually quiet. The streets were still damp from a light rain overnight, and the morning sun reflected off rows of historic homes that looked untouched by time. Neither of us talked much. Ethan finally broke the silence. "Whatever this is," he said, "don't let yesterday convince you you've already lost." I looked out the window. I'm not even sure what I'm fighting anymore.
"You'll know once you have the whole picture."
That was one of the reasons I loved him. He never tried to replace uncertainty with empty optimism. He believed facts had a way of calming fear. Whitmore Manor looked completely different before guests arrived. The grand iron gates stood open, gardeners trimmed hedges, florists unloaded white peonies from refrigerated vans. Everything felt peaceful. It was difficult to believe the same place had become the center of one of the biggest conflicts in my life. Eleanor was waiting near the entrance. She wasn't wearing the elegant suit from yesterday. Instead, she wore a simple navy cardigan and carried a ring of old brass keys. "Good morning," she said softly. "I'm glad you came." She looked toward Ethan. "You may join us if Miss Harrison wishes." I nodded. "He's family." Something in Eleanor's expression softened. I thought Thomas would appreciate hearing that. The comment stopped me. "You knew my grandfather," she smiled gently. "I knew the man he became." She led us away from the ballroom down a narrow hallway I hadn't noticed during previous visits. At the end of the corridor stood an old wooden door marked only with a small brass plaque. "Private Archives." Eleanor unlocked 3 separate locks before opening it. The room inside smelled faintly of cedar-old paper and polished wood. Shelves stretched from floor to ceiling. Leather-bound ledgers, blueprint tubes, photographs, boxes labeled by decade. Nothing about it resembled a wedding business. It looked more like a museum. "Our family has owned Whitmore Manor for almost 90 years," Eleanor explained. "We've kept every major document related to this property." She carefully removed a large ledger from one shelf. The cover was worn almost smooth. Gold lettering read, Restoration Records 1988 to 1994. She placed it on a long oak table. I imagine your grandfather never spoke much about Charleston. I shook my head. He loved old buildings. He never mentioned this estate. Eleanor nodded slowly. He wouldn't have. She opened the ledger. Inside were handwritten financial entries, invoices, receipts, contractor lists, architectural sketches. Everything was meticulously organized. She turned several pages before stopping. Then she quietly rotated the book toward me. There it was. One line. Simple. Almost ordinary. Donation received Thomas Harrison, confidential contributor. The amount beside his name made me stare. It wasn't a symbolic donation. It was enough money to save an entire restoration project. I looked back at Eleanor. My grandfather did this. Yes. I don't understand. She folded her hands. In the early 1990s, Whitmore Manor was nearly sold to developers. They intended to demolish most of the historic structures and replace them with luxury condominiums. I looked around the archive room. So this place almost disappeared. It came very close. She smiled sadly. My parents spent months searching for investors who cared more about preservation than profit. No one was interested. Until Thomas Harrison. I felt my throat tighten. My grandfather lived in North Carolina. He did. So why Charleston? Eleanor laughed softly. Because architecture was his first love. That surprised me. He wasn't an architect. No. But he wanted to become one. She reached into another archive box. Inside were dozens of old photographs. She handed me one. I almost dropped it. The picture showed my grandfather 30 years younger. He stood beside Eleanor's father wearing a hard hat. Behind them was Whitmore Manor. Half the building was covered in scaffolding, dust everywhere, workers carrying lumber. Grandpa was smiling, the kind of smile I remembered from childhood. That's him, I whispered. Eleanor nodded. He spent nearly every other weekend here for almost 2 years. I turned the photograph over. Written in faded ink were 8 words. For future generations who still value beautiful places. Thomas Harrison. I couldn't speak. Ethan gently squeezed my hand beneath the table. Eleanor continued. Thomas never wanted his name displayed publicly. He refused plaques. He refused newspaper interviews. He even refused our attempt to name one of the gardens after him. Why, he believed history should belong to everyone. I smiled through unexpected tears. That sounds exactly like him. She nodded. It does. For several moments, none of us said anything. Then Eleanor removed another folder. Unlike everything else in the room, this one had a modern archival label. Harrison Family Confidential. My heartbeat quickened. This, Eleanor said carefully, is why I asked you to return. She opened the folder. Inside were several letters tied together with dark green ribbon. Some were addressed to her parents. Some were addressed to attorneys. One envelope stood apart from the others. It had never been opened. The wax seal was still intact. Across the front, written in my grandfather's unmistakable handwriting, were the words to the Harrison descendant who reserves Whitmore Manor with love rather than obligation. I stared. I don't. My voice disappeared. Eleanor looked at me gently. My parents were instructed never to open it. Neither was I. We were only told to keep it safe until someone fulfilled that condition. I looked at the envelope again. How could he possibly know? He couldn't know who. He only knew someone eventually would. Daniel Foster quietly entered the archive room carrying a slim leather briefcase. He shook my hand. Miss Harrison. I apologize for joining late. I wanted to bring the legal records before we continued. He placed several certified documents on the table. I've reviewed every surviving agreement related to your grandfather's contribution. There are quite a few. I looked from him to Eleanor. So this envelope is legally mine? Daniel nodded. Potentially. What do you mean? Because Thomas Harrison didn't simply donate money. He negotiated conditions. My stomach tightened. What kind of conditions? Daniel opened one document. The restoration contribution was accompanied by a confidential legacy agreement. I leaned forward. He continued. The agreement grants one reservation privilege in every Harrison generation. I frowned. Reservation privilege, or meaning the estate must always offer priority booking to one qualifying Harrison descendant before accepting competing reservations. I blinked. So, yesterday? Yesterday should never have happened. Silence settled over the room. Daniel adjusted his glasses. But there is one additional condition. What condition? The qualifying descendant must be the individual specifically designated inside the sealed letter. I looked down at the untouched envelope. The wax seal reflected the morning sunlight coming through the archive window. For more than 30 years, no one had broken it. Not Eleanor, not her parents, not the attorneys, not even my own family. Daniel carefully slid a notarized authorization form toward me. If you choose to open it, he said quietly, we'll do it here, in front of witnesses. And once it's opened, he paused, it will answer far more than the question of who reserved a wedding venue. For several seconds, no one reached for the envelope. It rested in the middle of the oak table as though it had been waiting patiently for this exact morning. I traced the edges of the yellowed paper with my eyes, but resisted the urge to touch it. It wasn't fear. It was respect. Somehow, opening a letter my grandfather had sealed more than 30 years earlier felt like walking into a conversation that had been paused before I was old enough to understand it. Daniel Foster broke the silence. Before we proceed, I'd like to explain why this document remained sealed. He opened another folder from his briefcase. This wasn't simply your grandfather's personal letter. It was incorporated into a confidential legal agreement between Thomas Harrison and the Whitmore family. He slid a certified copy across the table. Near the bottom of the page was my grandfather's unmistakable signature, Thomas A. Harrison. Beside it were 2 witnesses and a notary seal dated just 8 months before he passed away. Daniel continued. The agreement required Whitmore Manor to preserve this letter unopened until one Harrison descendant personally reserved the estate for their own wedding. I frowned. So no one else in my family even knew it existed? Eleanor exchanged a glance with Daniel. Not exactly. That answer immediately caught my attention. What does not exactly mean? Daniel folded his hands. Certain members of your family knew there was a private agreement. They simply didn't know its contents. A cold feeling settled in my stomach. My father. Daniel nodded once. We'll come back to that. He wasn't avoiding the question. He simply wanted the documents to speak before speculation did. I appreciated that. It was the same approach I used in my own profession. Never start with conclusions. Start with evidence. Eleanor carefully picked up the envelope. The wax seal is intact. She turned it over for us to examine. No one has opened this since Thomas sealed it. Daniel photographed both sides before placing the images into the legal record. Standard preservation procedure, he explained. If questions arise later, we can establish an unbroken chain of custody. That simple sentence reminded me how carefully everyone in this room treated the truth. No drama, no assumptions, just documentation. Eleanor looked at me. Kelani, this belongs to you. She placed the envelope gently in front of me. My fingers trembled as I broke the wax seal. The crack echoed softly through the archive room. Inside was a single handwritten letter, several folded pages, one black and white photograph, and a smaller notarized attachment. I unfolded the first page. My grandfather's handwriting instantly transported me back 20 years. He had always written in neat blue ink with perfectly balanced letters. I could almost hear his voice. If you are reading this, then you found Whitmore Manor for the same reason I did. Not because someone told you it was fashionable, not because it impressed wealthy people, but because you saw beauty worth protecting. My eyes filled before I reached the second paragraph. Every family eventually faces the temptation to measure love by attention, money, or appearances. I hope ours never does. But if it does, I want one place in this family to remain beyond that competition. I swallowed hard. No one interrupted. He continued. This estate reminded me that lasting things survive because ordinary people quietly choose integrity over convenience. I have watched my children become adults. I have watched my grandchildren begin growing into themselves. Character always reveals itself in small decisions long before important ones arrive. I stopped reading for a moment. My grandfather had died when I was 12. The realization that he had spent so much time thinking about the future hurt in ways I hadn't expected. I continued, the reservation privilege attached to Whitmore Manor is not a reward. It is a reminder. The person who receives it should be the one who protects relationships instead of using them. Daniel quietly leaned closer. There's another page. I turned it over. The final paragraph was addressed to one person, not my family, not my grandchildren. One person. If your name is Kalani Harrison, then I have already had the privilege of watching you listen more than you speak. You notice people others overlook. You return borrowed things without being asked. You thank workers by name. You ask questions before judging. If life has not changed those qualities, then I trust you with this gift. I couldn't breathe for several seconds. My grandfather had written my name, specifically, personally, 30 years ago. Ethan looked at me. I didn't know. Neither did I. Daniel remained silent until I finished reading. Then he gently slid forward the notarized attachment. This is the legal designation. I unfolded it. Unlike the handwritten pages, this document had been typed. It formally designated me, Kalani Harrison, as the intended beneficiary of the Whitmore Manor Legacy Reservation privilege contingent upon my personally choosing the venue for my own wedding. Every requirement had already been satisfied. I had reserved the venue years before. I had personally signed the contract. The reservation had been made for my own marriage. Daniel pointed to one paragraph. The designation cannot be reassigned by any third party. I looked at him. What does that mean in plain English? It means your father never had legal authority to transfer your reservation to Brianna. Eleanor quietly added, neither did anyone working here. That statement immediately raised another question. Then how did it happen? Daniel opened another file. That's what we investigated after yesterday. He removed a printed activity report from the venue's reservation system. Every access to customer records was automatically logged. Dates, times, employee identification numbers, actions performed. He pointed to one entry. The afternoon after my father had visited my house. I stared. Someone had opened my reservation file. Then another entry appeared 2 days later. Customer notes modified. Another entry. Management review requested. Another. Priority reservation inquiry. I looked up. So someone started looking into my reservation almost immediately after Dad saw the folder. Correct. Daniel nodded. But continue. He turned another page. 3 weeks later, another notation appeared. Visitor identifying himself as immediate family member requested confirmation of reservation details. I frowned. Was that my father? We interviewed the employee, and the employee remembered speaking with Mr. Marcus Harrison. He introduced himself as the bride's father. That's true. Yes. But he also told the employee he was helping coordinate family wedding arrangements and needed to verify reservation information. I closed my eyes. The employee hadn't been careless. She had trusted someone who sounded entirely legitimate. Daniel continued. She confirmed your reservation existed. She did not cancel anything. She did not transfer ownership. She simply confirmed dates. So what changed? Daniel reached for another document. This. It was an internal memo. Months after that conversation, Brianna Harrison submitted an inquiry for the exact same wedding season. The coordinator noted a possible family scheduling conflict. Thinking she was helping avoid confusion, she escalated the matter to management. Because both brides shared the Harrison surname, because Marcus described himself as coordinating the family's plans, because no one knew about Thomas Harrison's confidential legacy agreement. Management mistakenly assumed the family had agreed to transfer the reservation. Eleanor lowered her head. That assumption was our mistake. We never should have accepted verbal family representations without your written authorization. She looked directly into my eyes. For that, I sincerely apologize. I believed her. Nothing in the record suggested malicious intent. Only a series of reasonable assumptions built on incomplete information. Then Daniel reached into the folder one final time. I've saved the most important discovery for last. He placed a thin photocopy on the table. It wasn't from Whitmore Manor. It came from probate court records. Across the top was a familiar name, Marcus Harrison. Request for estate correspondence, date received, 20 years earlier. My heartbeat slowed. Daniel tapped one highlighted sentence. Your father formally requested copies of every confidential communication relating to Thomas Harrison's charitable contributions. I looked at him carefully. Did he receive them? Daniel answered honestly. Most of them. I frowned. Most? He nodded. The sealed letter remained protected. But the request itself proved something significant. What? Daniel met my eyes. Your father knew there was a confidential legacy connected to Whitmore Manor. He simply never knew your grandfather had written your name inside it. I read the highlighted probate record 3 times before setting it back on the table. The wording never changed. Request for estate correspondence regarding charitable contributions and confidential agreements. Filed by Marcus Harrison, 20 years earlier. The date mattered. Grandpa had passed away only a few weeks before. Dad wasn't grieving in that document. He was searching. I looked at Daniel. So he knew Whitmore Manor existed? Yes. He knew Grandpa had some kind of agreement? Yes. But he didn't know it named me. Daniel nodded. That's the conclusion the documents support. He was careful with every word. He never said your father planned this. He said only what the evidence proved. As an architect, I appreciated that restraint. Facts carried far more weight than accusations. Eleanor quietly closed the restoration ledger. I've been asking myself the same question since yesterday. What question? If Marcus knew there was a confidential legacy, why wait until now? It was a good question. If Dad had been aware of Whitmore Manor for years, why had he suddenly become interested only after seeing my reservation folder? Daniel answered before I could. Because until your reservation existed, the legacy had no practical value. The room became quiet again. He continued. Thomas Harrison designed the agreement around one specific event. A descendant personally choosing Whitmore Manor for their own wedding. Without that choice, the letter remained sealed forever. I slowly understood. So my reservation activated everything. Exactly. And once Dad learned I'd reserved the estate, he realized something important might happen. But he didn't know exactly what. I leaned back in my chair. For the first time, my father's behavior made logical sense. Not morally, logically. He wasn't trying to steal something he fully understood. He was trying to control something he suspected might benefit the family. That difference mattered. It didn't excuse him, but it explained him. Eleanor excused herself to answer a phone call, leaving Ethan, Daniel, and me alone. Ethan reached for my hand. "What are you thinking? I don't think Dad ever expected this." The letter, "Oh, everything." I looked around the archive room. If Grandpa had simply left money, Dad would have understood it. But this, I gestured toward the old ledgers. This is about history, legacy, character. I don't think he ever imagined Grandpa would leave something that couldn't be measured in dollars. Ethan smiled faintly. "Your grandfather sounds like someone who understood people." "He did." Daniel looked thoughtful. "I believe he also understood families." That sentence lingered, because suddenly, dozens of childhood memories began fitting together differently. Grandpa had never openly criticized Dad. Never. But he had always encouraged me to think independently. When I was 11, he gave me a small leather notebook. "Write things down," he'd said. "Memory changes. Paper doesn't." At the time, I thought he meant homework. Now I wondered if he'd meant something much bigger. Daniel interrupted my thoughts. "Kelani, I'd like to ask you a few questions." "Of course." "Has your father ever asked you to sign documents without fully explaining them?" I frowned. "Probably." "Can you remember any?" I thought carefully. "My parents refinanced their house once. I signed something because the bank needed proof I'd temporarily transferred money into their account." Daniel nodded. "Anything involving your grandfather's estate?" I paused. "I honestly don't know. When Grandpa died, I was 12. There wasn't much for me to sign. After I turned 18, he waited. Then something surfaced. A memory so ordinary I had never considered it important. I think there was something. During college. What was it? My father said Grandpa's attorney was organizing family records. He told me everyone needed to sign acknowledgments confirming we'd received copies of estate information. Daniel immediately looked interested. "Do you remember the paperwork?" "Not really." "It was several pages. I signed where Dad marked. You didn't keep a copy?" I laughed softly. "I was 19. I barely kept copies of my class schedules." Daniel made a note. "Would you mind if we tried locating those records?" "Please." By late afternoon, we had moved from Whitmore Manor to Daniel's law office in downtown Charleston. Unlike the historic estate, his office was modern. Glass walls, light wood furniture, neatly organized shelves, nothing excessive. His legal assistant, Maria Alvarez, greeted us with several archive boxes already waiting in the conference room. "We requested certified probate copies this morning," she explained. "They arrived faster than expected." Daniel smiled. "Let's see what history remembers." For the next 2 hours, we sorted documents chronologically. Estate inventories, tax filings, correspondence, family notifications, distribution receipts. Most of it was completely ordinary. Grandpa's watch went to my uncle, his woodworking tools to another relative. His books were donated according to his wishes. Everything appeared organized, transparent, legal. Then Maria stopped turning pages. "I think you should look at this." She handed Daniel a document. He read silently for almost 30 seconds, then he slid it toward me. Across the top was a familiar title, Acknowledgement of receipt. My signature sat neatly at the bottom. I recognized it immediately. 19-year-old me had signed exactly where Dad had indicated. Daniel read aloud. This acknowledgement confirms receipt of publicly distributed estate materials. I frowned. That's harmless? It is. He turned the page. There should be an attachment. There wasn't, only a note. Attachment removed for confidential filing. Daniel looked toward Maria. Can we locate the attachment log? She searched another folder. After several minutes, she found it. The attachment had a reference number. No description, just a routing notation. Transferred upon request. Requested by Marcus Harrison. I stared. So Dad asked for it. Apparently. Did he keep it? Daniel shook his head. We don't know. The routing log only shows who requested transfer. What exactly was transferred? No description. Could it have been the Whitmore Manor agreement? It could have. But we can't say that yet. Again, facts before conclusions. I appreciated that. Even though emotionally I wanted certainty. Daniel continued reviewing the remaining documents. Everything else appeared routine until he found an old email printed from the estate attorney's records. The message had been sent shortly after Grandpa's funeral. From Estate Administration Office to Marcus Harrison, subject confidential materials. The body was brief. Certain confidential documents will remain sealed under the donor's instructions and will not be released at this time. Marcus had replied less than an hour later. Understood. Please notify me immediately if those restrictions are ever lifted. I slowly lowered the page. He was waiting. Daniel nodded. It appears so. For years. Not because he knew my name was inside, because he knew something valuable remained hidden. The realization unsettled me more than outright theft would have. Dad had spent decades watching a locked door without knowing what was behind it. Then, after seeing my Whitmore Manor reservation folder on my dining room table, he finally believed the door might be opening. He reacted. Not with questions, not with honesty, with control. As we packed the documents back into their folders, Ethan quietly asked the question that had been bothering both of us. If Marcus never knew Kalani was named, why was he so determined to give the venue to Brianna? Daniel didn't answer immediately. Instead, he walked to the conference room window overlooking Charleston Harbor. When lawyers investigate family disputes, he said, we eventually stop asking what people wanted. We ask what problem they believed they were solving. I looked at him. You think Dad thought he was solving a problem? I think he believed Brianna's wedding carried greater value to the family's reputation. He turned back toward us. Lucas Reed's family is well known in Charleston. The Whitmore estate is prestigious. If Marcus believed only one daughter could have that venue, he likely chose the daughter whose marriage he thought would elevate the Harrison family's social standing. I closed my eyes. That explanation hurt because it sounded exactly like my father. Not greedy, not cruel for the sake of cruelty. Obsessed with appearances, always believing the family's image justified unequal decisions. Just then, Maria knocked softly on the conference room door. I'm sorry to interrupt, but someone is here asking for Mr. Foster. Who? She hesitated. It's Marcus Harrison. Daniel and I looked at each other, then Maria added one more sentence. He says he just learned you've been reviewing Thomas Harrison's estate records, and he insists this meeting ends today. For a brief moment, nobody in the conference room spoke. Daniel didn't look surprised. He looked prepared. He closed the probate file, straightened the stack of documents, and glanced at me. The decision is yours. What do you mean? You decide whether Mr. Harrison comes into this room. I hadn't expected that.
My entire life conversations involving my father happened on his terms. He called. People answered. He invited. People came. He wanted to discuss something. Everyone adjusted their schedules. Daniel had just reminded me that I was no longer obligated to follow that pattern. I took a slow breath. Has he been told we're here? Maria nodded. He asked the receptionist whether Miss Harrison was with you. So he knew I was here. Yes. I exchanged a glance with Ethan. He didn't tell me what to do. He simply said, "Whatever you decide, don't let yourself be rushed." I thought for another few seconds. Invite him in. Maria nodded and quietly left the room. Less than a minute later, my father walked through the glass door. Marcus Harrison had always carried himself with quiet confidence. Even now, dressed in a navy sport coat and pressed khakis, he looked more like someone arriving for a business meeting than a family confrontation. His eyes landed on me first, then Ethan, then Daniel. Finally, the files spread across the conference table. His expression tightened for only a fraction of a second. "Kelani." "Dad." He forced a smile. "I've been trying to reach you." I turned my phone off. I noticed. His tone remained calm, almost friendly. Then he looked toward Daniel. "I assume you're Mr. Foster." "I am." Marcus extended his hand. Daniel shook it politely. "My daughter tells me you've become involved in what is essentially a family misunderstanding," Daniel answered evenly. "I've become involved in reviewing historical legal documents." It wasn't an argument. It was simply accurate. Dad pulled out a chair without asking and sat across from me. "I'd like to settle this before it grows into something unnecessary." I waited. He folded his hands. "Kelani, I know you're upset, but you're making this much bigger than it needs to be." I didn't answer immediately. Instead, I asked the question that mattered. "Did you know Grandpa had a confidential agreement with Whitmore Manor?" His face remained remarkably controlled. "I knew he supported the restoration years ago." "Did you know there was a sealed letter?" A brief pause. "I knew there were confidential estate materials." "So yes, I knew they existed. Did you ever tell me—" "No." "Why—" He sighed as though I were asking something unreasonable, "because they weren't relevant." Daniel quietly slid the probate request across the table. Marcus looked down at it. His eyes recognized the document immediately. "I'd forgotten about this." Daniel spoke for the first time since Marcus entered. "The record indicates otherwise." Marcus looked up. "I'm sorry." "You requested updates if the confidential restrictions were ever lifted." Dad leaned back. "Of course I did." My father had charitable commitments. As executor, I wanted complete records. Daniel calmly corrected him. "You were not the executor." Silence. Marcus blinked once. My brother handled most of that." Daniel nodded. "According to probate records, your older brother served as executor." "I did assist." "I'm sure you did." Again, Daniel wasn't arguing. He was simply keeping the conversation aligned with documented facts. Dad shifted his attention back toward me. "Kelani, this is exactly why I wanted to talk privately. You've hired someone who's turning paperwork into accusations." "I haven't accused you of anything." I finally spoke. "I've only asked questions." He looked frustrated. "Then let me answer them." "Fine. Why did you tell Whitmore Manor that Brianna would be using my wedding date?" He hesitated. "I never told them to cancel your wedding." "I asked them to help coordinate our family's plans." Daniel quietly reached for another folder. "The venue's interview notes indicate you represented yourself as managing family wedding arrangements." Dad looked toward him. "I was." "You were managing Brianna's." "I was managing both." I looked at him. "You never discussed my wedding with me." "I intended to." When
His mouth opened, then closed again. For the first time since entering the room, he didn't have an immediate answer. Instead, he chose a different path. Kehlani, I need you to understand something. Brianna's situation is different. I felt my shoulders tense. Different how? Lucas's family? He stopped searching for the right words. Moves in certain circles. I stared at him. You mean wealthy circles? He didn't deny it. They're respected. So are you and Ethan. But this wedding creates opportunities. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Opportunities. For whom? For the family. There it was. The sentence that explained almost everything. Not for Brianna. Not for me. For the family image. Dad continued speaking. Lucas's parents are connected throughout Charleston. Business leaders. Philanthropists. Judges. They host charity galas. They serve on preservation boards. A wedding at Whitmore Manor introduces Brianna into that community. I interrupted him. What about me? You've already built your career. You'll be fine. I laughed once. Not because it was funny, because I had heard those exact words my entire life. You'll be fine. Whenever something was taken from me, whenever someone else was prioritized, whenever fairness became inconvenient. Dad leaned forward. Kehlani, sometimes families have to make practical decisions. I met his eyes. No. Parents make decisions. Families discuss them. For the first time, he looked genuinely irritated. You're being emotional. Daniel quietly spoke before I could respond. Mr. Harrison, I'd like clarification regarding one point. Marcus looked toward him. You stated this decision benefited the family. Correct. Were you aware that Thomas Harrison's legal designation specifically named Kehlani Harrison? Dad frowned. No. Daniel placed the notarized designation on the table. Marcus read it silently. His expression changed. Not dramatically, just enough. His eyebrows lifted. His jaw tightened. He read the page a second time, then a third. Finally, he looked at me. I've never seen this. I believe you, I said. He blinked. You do. I believe you never knew Grandpa named me. For just a moment, relief crossed his face. Then I continued. But you still tried to give away something that wasn't yours. The relief disappeared. He looked down at the document again. I didn't know. You didn't ask either. He rubbed his forehead. I thought... You thought what? I thought your grandfather wanted whichever granddaughter's marriage best represented the family. I stared at him. You assumed. I interpreted. You never checked. There wasn't anything to check. There was! I pointed at the letter lying beside him. You could have told me Grandpa had a connection to Whitmore Manor. You could have asked Eleanor. You could have called the estate attorney. You could have spoken to me. Instead, you decided. The room became very quiet. Marcus looked older than he had an hour earlier. Not broken, just tired. After nearly a minute, he spoke again. I owe you an apology. I waited. He looked directly at me. I should have talked to you first. It sounded sincere, but something about it felt incomplete. Not because he wasn't sorry, because he was apologizing for the process, not the belief behind it. He still believed sacrificing my wedding for Brianna's social standing had been reasonable. Daniel seemed to notice the same thing. He gently closed the file. Mr. Harrison, I appreciate your willingness to speak honestly today. But before we discuss any resolution, he slid another certified document across the table. This statement was provided to us this morning by someone in your extended family. Marcus looked down. His expression immediately hardened. He recognized the handwriting before reading a single line. I looked at the signature. It belonged to my great-aunt Evelyn Harrison, my grandfather Thomas Harrison's younger sister. She was 91 years old, and according to the first sentence of her sworn statement, this was not the first time Marcus Harrison had ignored Thomas Harrison's written wishes for the sake of protecting the family's public image. No one spoke after Daniel placed Great-Aunt Evelyn's statement on the table. My father didn't reach for it. He simply stared at the signature. Evelyn Harrison. It was almost a whisper. I looked from him to Daniel. "You've already read it." Daniel nodded. "Yes. And before anyone says anything further, I'd like everyone to understand that this is a sworn written statement. It isn't a court finding. It reflects Mrs. Harrison's personal knowledge and recollection." I appreciated that distinction. He wasn't presenting it as absolute truth. He was presenting it as evidence that deserved to be examined. Marcus finally looked up. "My aunt is 91. Daniel answered calmly. "She is. Memory changes. It can. Which is why we compare recollections with documents. Again, evidence first." Daniel slid the statement toward me. "If you're comfortable, I'd like you to read it." I unfolded the pages. The handwriting wasn't Aunt Evelyn's. Someone had typed it for her, but every page carried her initials, and the last page bore her notarized signature. The first paragraph was simple. "I have known my nephew Marcus Harrison his entire life. I also knew my brother Thomas Harrison better than anyone still living." I kept reading. Thomas loved all of his grandchildren, but he often worried that Kelani would spend too much of her life trying to earn fairness instead of expecting it. My throat tightened. That sounded exactly like Grandpa. The next paragraph caught my attention immediately. Approximately 6 months before Thomas died, he asked Marcus and me to meet him at Whitmore Manor after a restoration fundraiser. I looked up. Dad, you were there." Marcus nodded once. "I visited Charleston. You never told me." "It wasn't something children needed to know." I continued reading. Thomas explained that he intended to preserve one family tradition outside financial inheritance. He believed money could create resentment, but shared history could strengthen future generations. I turned another page. Aunt Evelyn described sitting with Grandpa beneath one of Whitmore Manor's enormous live oak trees. According to her statement, Grandpa had spoken for nearly an hour. Not about property, not about investments, about values. He said appearances are the easiest inheritance to waste. I read aloud, "And character is the hardest one to protect." Marcus closed his eyes briefly. "I remember him saying that." It surprised me. "You remember?" "Yes." "Then why—" I couldn't finish the question because I genuinely wanted to understand. Daniel quietly encouraged him. "Mr. Harrison, if you're willing now would be an appropriate time." Dad remained silent for almost 30 seconds. When he finally spoke, his voice sounded different, less defensive. "I admired my father. I also spent most of my life believing he expected more from me than he expected from anyone else." No one interrupted. "He worked constantly. He believed promises mattered. If he said he'd be somewhere at 8, he arrived at 7:50. If he borrowed $20, he'd return 25. Marcus managed a tired smile. "I was never that disciplined, so I spent years trying to become the successful son he could finally be proud of." I listened carefully. For the first time, he wasn't just explaining his decisions. He was explaining himself. "When Brianna became engaged to Lucas," he continued, "I saw an opportunity." "What opportunity?" "A respected family. Strong connections. Stability. I thought if everything about that wedding looked perfect." He stopped.
Our family would finally look successful. I asked quietly, "Our family?" He nodded. "I thought your grandfather would have wanted that." I looked down at the letter Grandpa had actually written. "No. He wanted integrity, not image." There was a difference, a painful one. Daniel waited until the silence settled before speaking. "Mr. Harrison." "I believe that's exactly where this misunderstanding began." Dad looked toward him. "You believed your father's greatest concern was how the Harrison family appeared." Daniel gently tapped Grandpa's handwritten letter. "But every document we've reviewed suggests his concern was how family members treated one another." Marcus didn't argue. He simply looked exhausted. Daniel wasn't finished. "I'd like to show everyone something." He opened another archive folder Maria had prepared earlier that morning. Inside was an estate accounting summary. Nothing dramatic. Just columns of dates, descriptions, payments, distributions. He placed it in front of me. "I asked our forensic accountant to organize Thomas Harrison's estate decisions by category." I frowned. "Forensic accountant?" Daniel smiled. "Rachel Kim. She's very good at making complicated financial histories understandable." He pointed to the summary. "There was no unequal financial inheritance." I examined the chart. Every child received the same monetary distribution. Every tax filing matched. Every charitable donation had supporting records. Everything was balanced. So Grandpa treated everyone equally. "Financially." Daniel emphasized the last word. "Financially." He reached for another folder labeled Personal Requests. "This category isn't part of the estate." "What is it?" "Letters. Recommendations. Requests friends fulfilled after Thomas's death." There were dozens of them. A recommendation for a scholarship. A request to donate woodworking tools. A suggestion about preserving family photographs. Nothing carried legal force. Everything reflected Grandpa's personal wishes. Then Daniel showed me something unexpected. Across several years, Grandpa had repeatedly written letters introducing different family members to people who might help them professionally. My uncle had received an introduction to a business owner. A cousin received a recommendation for graduate school. Another relative received help finding an apprenticeship. Then Daniel pointed toward one entry. "Kalani Harrison, age 12, recommendation withheld until adulthood." I blinked. "What?" He opened another envelope. Inside was a copy of a letter Grandpa had addressed to the president of the North Carolina Preservation Foundation. It praised my curiosity about historic architecture. It described how I spent hours asking questions about old buildings instead of playing video games whenever I visited him. I smiled through tears. "I don't even remember that." Eleanor laughed softly. Thomas remembered. The recommendation had never been mailed, at least not then. Attached was Grandpa's handwritten note. "If Kalani still loves preserving old places when she's older, someone please help her find this letter." I looked at Daniel. "So Whitmore Manor wasn't the only thing." "No. It appears your grandfather quietly created opportunities for many people, but only if they naturally grew into them. Nothing had been forced, nothing guaranteed. Everything depended on character rather than entitlement. That was Grandpa, always planting seeds instead of giving shortcuts." Marcus stared at the letter for a long time. "I never knew about this." "I believe you," Daniel answered. "Because it wasn't addressed to you." Dad slowly nodded. Then he said something I never expected. "I spent years thinking my father trusted everyone else more than me." I looked at him. What if he simply trusted everyone differently? He didn't answer, because there wasn't one. Trust wasn't a prize. It reflected responsibility. For the next hour, we continued reviewing records. None of them suggested fraud. None showed hidden money. None revealed stolen property. Instead, they painted a much quieter picture. My father had spent decades trying to elevate the Harrison family's reputation. Grandpa had spent his life trying to elevate the Harrison family's character. Those goals looked similar from a distance. Up close, they were completely different. As we packed the final folders, Daniel closed his notebook. I think we've reached the point where the documents have answered most of the legal questions. What remains, he said, are personal ones. Before anyone could respond, my phone vibrated on the conference table. It was a text message. From Brianna. Only 8 words. Dad lied to me, too. Can we meet alone? I stared at Brianna's message for several seconds. Dad lied to me, too. Can we meet alone? It wasn't an apology. It wasn't a defense. It wasn't even a request to forgive her. Just 8 words. Simple. Careful. Unlike almost every conversation we'd had over the past week. Daniel noticed my expression. Everything all right? I turned my phone so everyone could see the screen. Marcus immediately stood. I don't think that's necessary. His reaction was faster than the message itself. I looked at him. Why not? Brianna is emotional right now. So am I. This conversation should happen later. I slipped the phone back into my purse. I'll decide that. It was a small sentence, but it felt strangely unfamiliar. Not because I had never disagreed with my father, because I had never stopped asking his permission first. Daniel gathered the remaining files. I believe today's meeting is finished. Marcus looked as though he wanted to argue. Instead, he quietly picked up his jacket. As he reached the door, he stopped without turning around. Kehlani. Yes. I never wanted you to think I loved you less. Then he walked out. I believed him. Oddly enough, that was part of what made everything hurt so much. Love had never been the problem. Judgment had. He loved both of his daughters. He simply believed one daughter's success belonged to the family, while the others needed to be protected. By the time Ethan and I reached the waterfront cafe where Brianna suggested meeting, the afternoon sun reflected across Charleston Harbor. It was the kind of peaceful afternoon that usually made people linger over coffee. Neither of us felt particularly peaceful. You want me to stay? Ethan asked. I smiled. I think this conversation belongs to my sister and me. He kissed my forehead. I'll be across the street if you need me. When I walked inside, Brianna was already sitting near the window. No makeup, hair tied back, an untouched cup of coffee in front of her. She looked exhausted. The confident younger sister who always seemed comfortable at family gatherings had disappeared. Hi, she said quietly. Hi. For several seconds, we simply looked at each other. Finally, she spoke. I'm sorry. I didn't answer immediately. She continued. I know that's not enough. No, it isn't. I figured. She gave a tired laugh before looking down at the table. I almost didn't come. What changed your mind? I heard Dad yelling at Mom this morning. That surprised me. He never yells. He did today. What happened? He blamed everyone. The venue. The attorney. You. Me. Himself. She paused. But then he said something I've been thinking about ever since. What? He said, I thought I was protecting this family. I looked out the window. That's exactly what he told us. Brianna nodded slowly. I know. Silence settled between us. Eventually, she reached into her handbag and removed a thin folder. I brought something. Inside were printed emails, text messages, a timeline she had typed herself. I want you to read these. I began with the oldest. Several months before her engagement, Dad had emailed Brianna photographs of Whitmore Manor.
His message read, "Beautiful place. Worth considering if your wedding moves to Charleston." I frowned. "You didn't know I'd already reserved it?" She shook her head immediately. "No!" I thought he was just showing me options. I continued reading. Weeks later, another message appeared. "Don't worry about availability. I'll handle the details." Another. "Kelani has different priorities now." Another. "She isn't attached to this venue the way you are." I looked up. "You believed him?" She nodded. "Why wouldn't I?" I couldn't answer, because until recently I probably would have believed him too. Brianna leaned forward. "Kelani, I need you to understand something. I never asked Dad to take your wedding. I thought—" She stopped. "I honestly thought you had changed your mind." I looked back down at the emails. Every message from Dad carefully avoided one important fact. He never said the reservation belonged to me. He implied, suggested, framed, but never directly stated it. That was my father. He rarely lied outright. He simply arranged information until people reached the conclusion he wanted. "I should have called you," Brianna whispered. "Yes. I know. I didn't. Because I trusted him." I slowly closed the folder. "So did I." For the first time all week, neither of us felt like opponents. We felt like two daughters trying to understand the same parent. Brianna wiped her eyes. "Can I tell you something embarrassing?" "Of course." "When I toured Whitmore Manor," she laughed softly through tears, "I kept thinking it didn't feel like me." "What do you mean?" "I like modern hotels. Clean lines, glass, city views. Whitmore Manor was beautiful." She smiled faintly. "But every time Dad talked about it, he sounded more excited than I was." That sentence explained another piece of the puzzle. The venue hadn't even been Brianna's dream. It had been Dad's symbol, his vision, his opportunity, not hers. She reached into the folder again and removed one final document. It was a reservation confirmation. Issued 3 weeks earlier, the bride's name read Brianna Harrison Reed. Across the bottom was a handwritten note. "Confirmed after family authorization." I stared at it. Family authorization. I asked the coordinator what that meant. What did she say? Dad handled everything. No names, no signatures, just another assumption built on trust. Brianna took a deep breath. "I already called Whitmore Manor this morning." My eyes met hers. "What did you tell them?" I withdrew. "You what?" "I canceled my reservation." I blinked. "They asked if I was sure." I said yes. "You don't have to do that because of me." She shook her head. "I'm not doing it because of you. I'm doing it because it was never really mine." For the first time in days, I felt something other than anger. Relief. Not because I had won. Because the truth no longer belonged to only one person. Brianna stood and walked toward the harbor windows. "I've spent my whole life believing Dad knew what was best." She folded her arms. "Now I think he mostly knew what looked best." Neither of us spoke for a while. The silence felt honest, not awkward. Finally, she turned around. "I'd like to come to your wedding." "You'll always be my sister. I know we can't fix everything overnight. We won't. But I'd like to try." I nodded. "I'd like that too." We hugged. It wasn't dramatic. It didn't erase 30 years of unequal treatment. It simply marked the first honest conversation we'd ever had without someone else's expectations standing between us. When we stepped outside, Ethan smiled the moment he saw our faces. "I'm guessing that went better than expected." It did. Before I could explain anything else, my phone rang again. This time it wasn't my father. It was Eleanor Whitmore. Her voice sounded unusually serious. "Kelani,
Yes. I thought you should know before you hear it from someone else. What happened? She hesitated. Your father has been calling relatives all afternoon. My stomach tightened. What is he saying? He's telling everyone that you used lawyers to force your own sister out of the wedding venue. She paused. And several members of your extended family now believe you've torn the Harrison family apart. When I ended the call with Eleanor, I didn't feel angry. I felt tired. For nearly a week, every new development had come with another misunderstanding to untangle, another assumption to correct, another version of the story that traveled faster than the truth. Brianna looked at me. He's calling everyone, isn't he? I nodded. He says I forced you out of the venue. She closed her eyes. I should have expected that. No. You shouldn't have to. Ethan walked over. What happened? I explained Eleanor's call. He listened quietly before asking one question. What do you want to do? It was becoming a pattern. Not, what should we do? Not, how do we fight this? What do you want to do? A month earlier, I probably would have said I wanted everyone to know the truth. Now my answer was different. I don't want to chase rumors. I only want to answer them if they're brought to me. Ethan smiled. I think that's the healthiest thing you've said all week. Daniel agreed. When I called him later that afternoon, he said something similar. People who manipulate narratives often expect others to spend all their energy correcting them. So what do I do? You don't organize a campaign. You attend the mediation already scheduled by Whitmore Manor. You present the documents. You answer questions. And then you let adults decide what they believe. That sounded far less satisfying than exposing my father publicly. It also sounded far wiser. Whitmore Manor had already scheduled a formal mediation to resolve every question surrounding the reservation. Although there wasn't a lawsuit, Eleanor wanted the record corrected properly because several vendors had already become confused about which bride was actually getting married there. The meeting took place 3 days later in one of the estate's historic conference rooms. Present were Eleanor Whitmore, Daniel Foster, the estate's operations manager, their reservation coordinator, my parents, Brianna and Lucas, Ethan, and 6 members of my extended family who had requested permission to attend after hearing conflicting versions of the story. Nobody looked comfortable. My father sat perfectly straight with his hands folded. My mother, Denise, looked exhausted. She hadn't said much since everything began. Eleanor opened the meeting. Thank you for coming. Our purpose today isn't to assign shame. It's to establish an accurate record regarding the Harrison reservation. That sentence immediately lowered the tension. No accusations, just facts. Daniel stood. I've organized the documents chronologically. He placed a binder in front of every attendee. Each tab carried a date, reservation, payment, correspondence, probate records, legacy agreement, internal venue notes. Nothing dramatic, nothing hidden, just an orderly timeline. As we review each document, Daniel said, please stop me if anything appears inaccurate. He began with the easiest facts. My original reservation, the deposit receipt, the confirmation emails. Every document carried my signature. Every payment came from my account. No one questioned them. Next came the venue's internal access log. Daniel explained how Marcus had identified himself as the bride's father while requesting reservation information. My father nodded. I did. I wasn't trying to deceive anyone. I understand, Daniel replied. The records don't suggest intentional deception at that stage. Marcus seemed relieved. Then Daniel continued. The problem arose because subsequent conversations relied upon assumptions instead of written authorization. He displayed the internal management note. Possible family transfer. No signed request.
No authorization from me, no legal transfer. Only an assumption. Eleanor spoke next. Our staff made an error. We believed the Harrison family had reached a private agreement. We should have required written authorization from the original contract holder. She turned toward me. On behalf of Whitmore Manor, I apologize again. I appreciated something about her apology. She didn't say, "I'm sorry you feel hurt." She apologized for a specific mistake. Accountability sounded different from sympathy. Then Daniel moved to the confidential legacy agreement. This time, every person in the room became completely silent. He summarized Grandpa Thomas Harrison's restoration contribution. He explained the preserved reservation privilege. He clarified that the sealed letter had remained unopened until I personally fulfilled the conditions. No one interrupted. Even Lucas, who had barely spoken throughout the meeting, leaned forward with genuine interest. Finally, Daniel held up Grandpa's handwritten letter. I won't read the personal portions aloud. They belong to Miss Harrison, but the legal designation is relevant. He projected the notarized page onto a screen. There it was. Kalani Harrison. My name. Written decades before I became engaged. Written before I even knew Whitmore Manor existed. The room remained silent. Then my oldest cousin quietly asked, "So, Uncle Marcus couldn't legally transfer this?" Daniel answered simply, "No. He never possessed that authority." My father lowered his eyes. No argument. No explanation. Just silence. One by one, relatives began asking questions, not hostile ones, honest ones. When did Kalani make the reservation? Almost 2 years ago. When did Brianna reserve hers? Several months later. Did Brianna know? Daniel looked toward my sister. I'll let Miss Harrison answer. Brianna took a slow breath. I believed Dad when he told me Kaylani had moved on. I never called her. I should have. She looked at me. I'm sorry. I nodded gently. I know. No one clapped. No one cried. It was simply the truth. Then something unexpected happened. My mother asked if she could speak. Everyone turned toward Denise. She clasped her hands tightly. I owe both of my daughters an apology. Her voice trembled. I spent years convincing myself that keeping peace was the same as doing what was right. She looked first at Brianna. I protected you from consequences. Then she looked at me, and I expected you to absorb disappointment because you always could. Tears filled her eyes. I told myself that was strength. It wasn't. It was unfair. I reached across the table and squeezed her hand. Not because everything was healed, because accountability deserved acknowledgement. Marcus remained quiet. For several minutes, no one looked at him. Finally, Eleanor spoke. Mr. Harrison, would you like to add anything? He slowly stood. I've spent my entire adult life believing a family's reputation protected its future. He looked around the room. I see now that I protected the appearance of my family more carefully than the people inside it. No one interrupted. I thought I was helping. I know that doesn't undo what happened, but it's the truth. It wasn't a perfect apology. It wasn't dramatic. It also wasn't defensive. It was probably the most honest thing I'd ever heard my father say. The mediation concluded shortly afterward. Whitmore Manor formally reinstated my original reservation. Every vendor received written confirmation. The administrative record was corrected. No lawsuit, no public scandal, just documentation. Exactly the way Grandpa probably would have wanted. As people slowly gathered their things, several relatives approached me quietly. One aunt hugged me. A cousin apologized for believing rumors. Lucas shook my hand. I hope one day you can believe this. What? I never cared where Brianna and I got married.
I would have married her in our backyard. I smiled. I believe you. Then just as Ethan and I were preparing to leave, my father touched my shoulder. Kelani. I turned around. Could we talk? I looked at him for a long moment. Then I nodded. Not here. He understood immediately. When? Tomorrow morning. Just us. He quietly agreed. As Ethan and I walked toward the parking lot, I wasn't wondering whether my father would apologize again. I was wondering something much harder. If he finally accepted the truth, could I forgive him without giving him the same unrestricted access to my life that had allowed all of this to happen in the first place? The next morning, I drove to the small park where my grandfather used to bring me on Saturday mornings. It wasn't planned. When Dad asked if we could talk, I could have chosen his house, my office, or Daniel's conference room. Instead, I chose the place where I had learned what quiet looked like. The park hadn't changed much. The wooden benches had been replaced. The walking paths were smoother, but the old oak trees were still there. Grandpa used to tell me that trees never rushed to prove they were growing. They just keep growing, he'd say. Dad was already waiting when I arrived. He stood as I walked toward him. Neither of us hugged. Neither of us reached for the other. We simply sat on the same bench with a few feet of space between us. For a while, we watched people walking dogs and parents pushing strollers. Finally, he spoke. I came here after your grandfather's funeral. I looked at him. I've never told anyone that. You never brought us here. I couldn't. His voice cracked slightly. I was angry. At Grandpa, at myself. That wasn't the answer I expected. He looked down at his hands. When my father died, I kept wondering why nothing I ever did felt like enough. I listened without interrupting. I built a business. I raised 2 daughters. I stayed married. I paid my bills. But whenever I thought about him, he smiled sadly. I still felt like the son trying to earn one more compliment. For the first time, I understood something that had never occurred to me. Dad hadn't spent decades competing with me. He had spent decades competing with a version of himself that only existed in his own mind. The Whitmore Manor situation, he continued, wasn't really about a wedding. I know. It was about me believing that if Brianna married into the right family. He paused. Then somehow, I'd finally built the successful family I thought my father wanted. I quietly unfolded Grandpa's letter from my purse. I carried it everywhere now, not because it was legally important anymore, because it reminded me of who he actually was. I handed it to Dad. You've never read the whole thing? He accepted it carefully. For nearly 10 minutes, he read every page. He didn't rush. He didn't skip ahead. When he finished, he folded it exactly the way I had found it. Then he wiped his eyes. I spent 30 years misunderstanding him. I nodded. I think you did. I also misunderstood you. There it was. Not an excuse, not a justification. A recognition. You always seemed so capable, he said. When something difficult happened, you handled it. So I convinced myself you needed less. I smiled sadly. I needed less rescuing, not less love. He closed his eyes. I know. We sat quietly again. Then he asked the question I had been expecting since the mediation. Can you forgive me? I answered honestly. Yes. He looked relieved. Before he could speak again, I continued. But forgiveness isn't the same thing as returning everything to the way it was. His expression changed. Not hurt. Thoughtful. I figured. I love you. I always will. But I won't hand you control over my decisions again. No more signing documents without reading them. No more letting someone else speak to vendors on my behalf. No more accepting "it's for the family" as an explanation. He slowly nodded. That's fair. If you want a relationship with me, I do. Then it has to be built on honesty instead of obligation. I understand. And if something concerns my marriage? I smiled. You talk to Ethan and me. Not about us. To us. He nodded again. I can do that. For the first time in years, I believed he meant it. Not because people suddenly change overnight, because he had finally stopped defending the past. That was where change usually began. 3 months later, Whitmore Manor looked exactly the way I remembered from my very first visit. The gardens were in full bloom. Soft spring sunlight filtered through the enormous live oaks. Guests wandered the brick pathways before the ceremony. Everything felt peaceful. Brianna arrived early. She wasn't wearing white. She chose a simple emerald green dress that complemented the gardens beautifully. When she hugged me, she whispered, "Thank you for giving me another chance to be your sister." I smiled. "Thank you for taking it." Lucas stood beside her. "I'm glad this is exactly where it was always supposed to happen." "So am I." Mom found me a few minutes before the ceremony. She adjusted a loose strand of my hair the way she used to when I was little. "I'm proud of you." It was a simple sentence. She had probably spoken it before, but this time it wasn't attached to my ability to endure disappointment. It was attached to the boundaries I had finally learned to protect. Then Dad walked into the bridal suite. He hesitated near the door. "You look beautiful." "Thank you." "I wanted to ask," he smiled nervously, "would you still like me to walk you down the aisle?" I looked at him for several seconds. Months earlier, I probably would have answered from guilt. Now I answered from choice. Yes, I would. His shoulders relaxed. "Thank you." As we began walking toward the ceremony, he quietly said, "I'll spend the rest of my life trying to deserve this." I didn't answer. Not because I doubted him, because proving that wasn't my responsibility anymore. Outside, Ethan was waiting beneath the old oak trees. As I reached the front, Dad squeezed my hand once before placing it into Ethan's. Then he stepped back, not as someone giving permission, as someone learning to let go. The ceremony itself was exactly what Ethan and I had wanted. No extravagance, no performance, just family, friends, promises. After the reception, Eleanor asked if she could show us one final room before we left. She led Ethan and me back into the private archive, the same room where everything had begun. She carried a beautifully framed photograph. It showed my grandfather wearing a hard hat beside her father during Whitmore Manor's restoration. Below the photograph was a small engraved brass plate. It didn't hang on a public wall. It wasn't displayed for visitors. It stayed inside the archive. The engraving read, "Thomas Harrison, a man who believed beautiful places should outlive pride." Eleanor handed me a duplicate copy. "He asked us never to name a garden after him," she smiled. "But he never said his granddaughter couldn't keep a photograph." I laughed through tears. "It'll have the best place in our home." As Ethan and I drove back to Charlotte the next morning, I realized something that surprised me. The happiest part of the entire experience wasn't winning the venue. It wasn't proving my father wrong. It wasn't even discovering Grandpa's hidden legacy. It was understanding that boundaries had given our family the first real opportunity to become honest with one another. Some relationships became stronger, some became more careful. All became healthier. Dad and I still talk regularly. He no longer makes decisions for me. If he has an opinion, he asks whether I want to hear it. Sometimes I do, sometimes I don't. He respects both answers. Brianna and I now meet for lunch almost every month. We're still rebuilding. Trust grows slowly. But this time it's growing in the right direction.
Grandpa was right. Buildings remember the people who care for them. Families do too. The difference is that buildings need maintenance. Families need truth. And sometimes the strongest foundation you can build isn't made from stone at all. It's built by finally saying, I love you, but this is where my boundary begins. There was a time when I believed keeping the peace meant accepting whatever my family decided. I thought saying yes made me loving and staying quiet made me mature. What I eventually learned is that peace built on silence rarely lasts. Healthy relationships require honesty, accountability, and respect for one another's boundaries. If you've ever been treated as the strong one, in your family, you may have been expected to carry disappointments that should never have belonged to you. Being capable does not mean your feelings matter less. Being independent does not mean your dreams are available for someone else to sacrifice. Forgiveness can be deeply healing, but it is not the same as restoring unlimited access to your life. You can forgive someone while still expecting healthier behavior. You can love your family while refusing to let guilt replace respect. Boundaries are not punishment. They are the structure that allows trust to grow again. If this story reminded you of your own experiences, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Have you ever had to choose between keeping the peace and protecting yourself? Share your perspective in the comments. Your story may encourage someone else who feels alone. And if you enjoy thoughtful stories about family resilience, justice, and healing, consider subscribing for more. This is a fictional story created for entertainment, education, and reflection.